My name's George Caldow. I'm a cattle vet working in herd-level diagnostics of infectious disease in Great Britain. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about herd-level diagnostics and approach for BVD control and eradication. We've been working on BVD eradication for the past 20 years. We have voluntary programs and we have national programs. And over those years, we've learned a lot from our own experiences and from those of others. And I'd like to share those with you today. And we all know with BVD that the way the disease is spread around is with the carrier animals or the PI animals. And whilst it's certainly the case that some PI animals will be poorer than the rest round about, mostly you cannot tell a PI just by looking at it. This animal here, for example, was sold for 8,000 guineas, which equates to about 10,000 US dollars. This is a pedigree black Limousin, and only when they got it home and did the biosecurity check did they find out that it was a PI animal. So there's clearly a need for good diagnostic tests. So for BVD control, you have to understand that it's driven by two things: the presence of these PI animals, but just as important is the presence of the BVDV naive animals, animals which have no protection against the disease. And to control BVD, we've got to reduce the contact, direct or indirect, between these two groups of animals. And we can achieve that through best practice biosecurity and vaccination. But it's also clear that we need to be able to detect those PI animals and detect exposure. And we need effective diagnostic tests for that. These tests should be sensitive, they should be specific, and above all, in large-scale control programs at herd level, they need to be affordable and as cheap as possible. And the tests should be able to detect the PI animals with precision and detect exposure to those PI animals in order to determine whether or not a whole herd hunt for a PI animal is justified. It's also needed for post-control surveillance to see if the control programs have been successful. There are different approaches to eradicating BVD from a herd. Currently, most countries will be featuring on identifying virus-positive animals and removing them through tissue testing and blood sampling. But previously, we used antibody detection systems, and the people that pioneered this were the Scandinavian countries. Essentially, these were the tests that they had available to them, but they showed that the Antibody ELISA could be used to differentiate infected herds from non-infected herds with a high degree of sensitivity and specificity. And what they did was they used 5 animals per group in the immature animals to screen for antibody, and this was the spot test, and they used bulk milk tests in the dairy herds to detect antibody as well. The sensitivity of these tests is not so important, but the specificity must be maximal. And the reason the sensitivity is not so important, because if it's so finely tuned, then we generate too many false positive signals and waste a lot of resource chasing down evidence of infection that is in fact a false signal. The BVD antibody ELISA target antigen can vary quite significantly. It can be whole virus or it can be parts of the virus itself. And if we look at the diagram of the structural proteins and non-structural proteins, we can see that we have the P80NS3, which is one of the non-structural proteins. We have ERNS, which is one of the structural proteins. The test can be indirect or it can be blocking. The ERNS, of course, is produced in excess, so there's lots of it around in infected animals. E2 is antigenically variable protein, and it's one of the major antigens and the main components of the inactivated vaccines. And NS23 is the important factor in relation to non-cytopathic virus changing into the cytopathic virus as this protein cleaves. So the non-structural proteins are not present in any amount in the vaccines which are inactivated, whereas they will be present and created when it's a modified live vaccine that's used. And this is important because it gives the opportunity for a DIVA test, so the ability to differentiate infected from vaccinated animals at the antibody level. So if we look at the P80, which is the NS3, which is a non-structural protein, this is the focus for the DIVA antibody test, which is widely used. It does function as a DIVA test to a reasonable degree. Our experience with using the inactivated vaccines is that nearly all of these animals are going to be negative for antibody to P80 by around 90 days post-vaccination. And the occasional positives that we do detect will usually, on retest after a month or 6 weeks, have lower levels of antibody, and we can discount active infection. And even if you use a test which is based on the whole virus, such as the ELISA ELISA, it's possible to use bulk tank milk for surveillance, providing the herd vaccination is administered on a day that the bulk tank milk sample is actually collected. So you are actually allowing 90 days before you take the next test. So our advice has been to avoid the use of multi-component BRD vaccines and to carry out surveillance bleeds prior to initiating vaccination of the breeding animals. So that gives you a window from 9 months to about 13 months. The next issue that we have to deal with in relation to antibody test is the maternally derived antibody. In animals where the dam's been exposed to BVD virus, the antibody that the calf gets is likely to persist for up to 9 months. And it begins to be able to differentiate this antibody, this maternally derived antibody, from active immunity by around 6 months of age. And what we found is that in herds that are vaccinated with the inactivated vaccines, and where there has been no adult exposure in the recent past, most calves are going to be negative for antibody to P80 by about 6 months of age. And this allows younger animals to be tested in the spot test when they're sold off. In herds that are vaccinated with the live vaccine, the antibody profile in unvaccinated young stock is similar to that in herds with historical exposure to the virus. The other thing to think about in relation to maternally derived antibody is the relationship in PI animals. Do PI animals get rid of maternally derived antibody more quickly? And they certainly do. But it can still be detected for up to about 4 months in some PI animals. And as many as 15% of PI cattle will have some antibody that will be detected in our tests. And it's important to consider that antibody positives should not be excluded as possible candidates for PIs. There's also the issue that some PI animals, when they are infected with a sufficiently different virus to the one that they have, will produce some antibody as well. This cartoon that you see before you is a technique that we've used to get over the complexity of BVD and BVD control to our farmers. And what we have here is a representation of the 3 states that occur. We have the white cows, which are those which have never seen infection before. We have the green cows, which are those that have encountered transient infection and developed a serological response. And we have the red cows, which are the PI animals. And this is a story which is readily grasped by our farmers when we're discussing control. But it's also quite a useful technique to consider the dynamics of infection in a herd. And the next series of slides will show that. So rather than have numbers of white cows, I use a block presentation here. So this block here is the adult milking herd. If you have a PI animal within that block, then most of the animals roundabout will become exposed and develop antibody and therefore be green. But in any herd of any size, there will always be a component of naive animals entering, and there will be some animals that will lose their immunity as well. The next thing to consider is our first bred females, which can often be completely separate from the herd and be naive. And then following that, we have the calves. Now, the calves are going to mirror what happens in the adult breeding herd. So pre-breeding, these calves will reflect initially the maternally derived antibody from their mothers, and then this will dissipate with time so that by 9 months, these animals are serologically negative. If you put a PI animal in amongst that group, then in a relatively short period of time, most of the animals again will be exposed and go green. So if we think about using our diagnostic tests in that situation to categorize these situations, first of all, in the adult herd, what we have in a dairy herd is the bulk tank milk antibody, which will correctly identify whether or not there has been exposure. It may be exposure several years ago, but nevertheless, it will test positive. We can use a composite sample from first lactation animals to show if there has been a more recent exposure, and we can use the bulk tank milk for BVD virus detection with PCR. And in the young calves, post 9 months of age, we can do the spot tests in heifer groups, in groups of calves, and we can do individual virus tests to screen for the PI animals. So we have a way of identifying whether BVD is active in these herds. And if we think about how we will classify the herd status and spot test, there are a number of things to consider with the spot test. First of all, it's going to detect if there has been 50% seroconversion in the group with a high degree of confidence, assuming a test with a greater than 95% sensitivity, which is what we have. The spot test should be 5 animals per group. The animals should be 9 months of age, and each separate group must be surveyed. To allow for this 50% seroprevalence, the group has to have been together with the PI animal for at least 2 months. And in situations where there is group housing at winter periods, then this is easily achieved by scheduling the test at the appropriate time. Purchased animals are not telling you about exposure necessarily in the herd that we're looking at that could have come with antibodies, so they should be excluded from this. Vaccinated animals should be avoided if at all possible. And one of the things that's really important in BVD control is to remember that the TI animals are poorly infectious. So if you get fomite spread into these groups, you will get relatively few seroconversions and you will not pick it up with a spot test. So introduction via transient infection quite often will still lead to a negative spot test in the herd. If we look a little bit closer at the use of bulk tank milk antibody, this is highly sensitive. It's been shown to be in the Scandinavian program to be an extremely useful and sensitive test, but it has a poor positive predictive value because once exposed, cows are likely to stay positive for several years. All you need is around 5% of the herd to be seropositive to be giving you a bulk tank milk antibody test positive. And therefore, for those reasons, it has a poor positive predictive value. If the herd is negative, it has extremely good negative predictive value. As I said, if fewer than 5% seropositive in the herd, then the bulk tank milk is going to be testing negative. Recent modelling done in Denmark, where the assumption would be that infection would be introduced by a fomite transient infection rather than by a PI, it's shown that in that situation, the bulk tank milk antibody will in fact give a late signal and therefore be a relatively poor indicator of infection. And what we do know is that those herds which are using inactivated vaccines and have been unexposed, the milk antibody test is going to be low positive and even negative. So it allows the bulk tank milk to be used to monitor exposure in those situations. Unexposed herds that use the modified live vaccines, however, are going to test strongly positive for antibody in bulk tank milk. And bulk tank antibody cannot be used to monitor exposure in those situations. So if we're going to look at those tests and how we're going to use them in the herd, the spot test on calf crops is a sensitive indicator, providing all groups of calves are surveyed, and it's important that the survey is carried out with that in mind. The bulk tank milk antibody is a good indicator of herd status for the negative herd, but it's a late indicator if infection is introduced via fomite, and bulk tank milk should be monitored as frequently as possible. So if we go back to looking for the virus in these animals, the first tests that were used in terms of Antigen ELISA were non-structural protein NS3 which is strongly blocked by MDA, and the impact that that has is that it delays testing to around 4 months of a calf's life. So that effectively means that in the beef cow herd situation, you struggle to test calves and have them out of the herd before the breeding season starts. And it's really important that you can block the ongoing transmission to new pregnancies by removing those calves. The next generation of the target was the structural protein ER&S, and as we've already said, that's produced in excess. It's blocked by MDA for a much shorter period of time, for only about 1 month in serum and blood. And this is now the industry standard and used throughout much of the world. The other thing that we have to consider is what sample you're going to take. And originally it was blood sample that was used, but now with the ear tissue collecting samples, the sample can be collected when the animal is ear tagged. The tissue sample collected in this way is not blocked by MDA, and the virus in the tissue can then be used as a very reliable test medium. The impact of maternally derived antibody on the antigen ELISA is that in serum it's going to be negative for at least 14 days, the first 14 days. Tissue, it's reduced but still detectable, giving positive results in PI animals. Things to watch out for is that high environmental temperatures are going to reduce detectable ER&S. So if people have mishandled samples, left them in the cab of a truck, then you're likely to get false negatives in that situation. The PCR, the serum is depressed for around day 18, but it's always going to give you a positive result. And the tissue, there's no appreciable reduction in detectable virus. Through our experience and the published literature, the conclusion is that the lowest viral load is seen in the 3rd week of life. And our advice to our farmer clients is to tag early or to tag after 3 weeks. In terms of field experience, in those countries that are using tissue testing and blood sampling to identify PIs and remove them, if we look at what's happened with ER&S ELISA, in the German situation, 8 PIs missed from 233 calves in one field outbreak. In the Austrian program, 2.7% of PI animals missed. And this is data from the Swiss control program. And what we can see here is at the top we have the data for the ER&S. This was a group of animals that were tested on 2 occasions. They were split into a positive group and a negative group. And if we look at the positives in the ER&S ELISA, first of all, what we see on retest, 85% of the animals that were initially detected positive remained positive. So we had 15% that were not PI animals. Very similar situation with the PCR, so there it was 84%, so very similar performance. But if we look at the repeat on the negatives, what we found there, and this is an indication of sensitivity, what we found there was that the animals which were originally tested negative, 2.5% of them subsequently tested positive, so that ER&S ELISA missed up to 2.5% of the PIs that were in the population. And if we look at PCR, there it's much lower, less than 1%. So there's a difference in sensitivity between the 2 tests. So if we just summarize in the diagnostic gap, and the diagnostic gap in relation to BVD virus detection is the period where maternally derived antibody interferes with the test. And it's going to depend on which test and which sample type. So if we look at serum and antigen ER&S antigen ELISA, the first month of life is the block, and there's no gap on tissue. For PCR, no gap in either situation. PCR pool, where you can aggregate samples and test them through a pooling system. First 6 weeks of life is what some laboratories advise for serum, but no gap on tissues. And the antibody spot test, as we've already outlined, first 9 months of life is the gap caused by maternally derived antibody. So our conclusions on the BVDV diagnostic tests is that the Antigen ELISA sensitivity is 97%. Around 80 to 90% of animals which are identified as viremic will confirm as PI on retest. Therefore, it's good advice to retest virus positives to confirm PI status. The PCR has a marginally better sensitivity. If you're using tissue tags, tag early and keep tissue samples cool. The bulk tank milk PCR has an analytical sensitivity of at least detecting 1 PI in 300 milkers. And if we look at how we use those tests in beef cow herds, it's fairly straightforward. A simple system exists. Where there is evidence of active BVD infection, all immature animals in the herd are tested. Test all the animals that are not the mother of a tested calf. So the test of the calf is the proxy for the mother's test. Confirm all virus positives with a second test, and test all mothers of PI calves. Because there have been PIs running around, or certainly in herds where there have been PIs running around, you need to continue to test all calves born for at least the next 9 months, and we recommend the next 12 months. And at the end of that cycle, BVD should be eradicated from the herd. In dairy herds, the situation is very similar, but we have the advantage of using bulk tank milk as a screening test. So bulk tank milk, looking for the virus. If it's positive, it's been shown that the PI animal is likely to reside amongst either the first lactation animals or those that are in the bottom 10% by yield. So you can screen those animals preferentially. Confirm the PI animals as before, remove and repeat the bulk tank milk PCR subsequently. And then test all animals that haven't contributed to the bulk tank during this period, and test all animals born in the next 12 months as you would in the beef cow herd. And our experience would be that once you start this cycle in the dairy herds is to progress it quickly, because in large dairy herds, the number of animals that are leaving regularly through poor lactation, disease or injury could mean that your PI can slip out the herd, and it can be quite frustrating to be screening those herds and not identifying a PI animal, despite there being clear evidence that there was and has been a PI animal active in the herd. And finally, with all of these programs, one of the important things to understand is that the BVD virus is constantly mutating and changing, and there is a constant challenge to our virus detection systems, added to the fact that we have pestiviruses in other ruminant populations. So we have, in most of the world, BVD1 predominates. Certainly in North America, BVD type 2 is common. We have border disease virus in small ruminant populations. We have Hobie virus emerging in many areas of the world now. And the question that we have to ask is, are our diagnostic tests able to detect these different viruses or exposure to them with the antibody tests? So looking at this, we have our tests along the top, ER&S antigen ELISA, PCR, and then the P80 antibody ELISA. So BVD virus 1, the antigen ELISA is going to detect all variants, as does the PCR, and the P80 antibody ELISA is extremely sensitive for that. With BVD2, the important difference there is that the sensitivity of the antibody ELISA can be reduced. Border disease virus, the antigen, the ER&S antigen ELISA actually is only going to pick up about half the common border disease virus strains that are present. PCR will detect all the variants, and again, as with BVD type 2, the P80 antibody ELISA has reduced sensitivity. And for Hobie virus, so far, what we've found is that the ER&S antigen ELISA detects known variants, as does the PCR, and the sensitivity of the antibody ELISA is reduced. In the past, the antigen ELISA failed to pick up a BVD type 1, and the test was altered to accommodate that. The PCR tests are going to vary depending on their target, and the explanation I've given there applies to one test only. And what we see with reduced sensitivity for serology is that we see reduced levels of antibody being detected in these ELISAs. It takes longer time for the animals to seroconvert, and occasionally some infected animals will not seroconvert. So if you're looking at a group of animals, you can usually differentiate the type 1 type from BVD2 border disease, but you can't confirm that. It can only be a suspicion that you're left with after looking at the test results. And if we look at the role of vaccination in these control programs, essentially our advice is that vaccination is a cornerstone to it. And the reason being that you're creating naive populations in a situation where boundary biosecurity can never be 100%. Cattle have the habit of escaping, and they can travel many miles before being introduced to herds. Therefore, vaccination is a critical part in the control program. Those that are using inactivated vaccines may be able to use bulk tank milk antibody for surveillance. Those using the modified live vaccines cannot use bulk tank milk antibody. However, the spot tests can still be used and should be recommended, providing they're used in the window from 9 months to when vaccination is initiated. And that is the best approach to monitoring the success of these control programs. And the bulk tank milk for PCR for BVD virus remains an effective screening test for PI in the adult herd, irrespective of the vaccination history. So my conclusions on BVD eradication and herd-level diagnostic control is that the tests are fit for purpose, the testing systems are fit for purpose. The things to be aware of include the diagnostic gap created by maternally derived antibody, and be aware that none of these tests are 100% sensitive and specific, and there will be occasions where you will need to question the results and resample, retest individuals. Eradication of BVD virus is certainly achievable at the herd level and at the national level, has been shown by the successful control programs in Europe. And if we're going down that route, we need to constantly review the test performance and surveillance of new and emerging viruses as an essential part of our control program. So I'd just like to acknowledge some of my colleagues that I've worked with over this. Peter Nettleton is the senior virologist at Modern Research Institute. My colleagues within my team on the BVD control and eradication program are listed there. And we work very closely with colleagues in the field, including our farmer colleagues, to achieve a successful outcome. Thank you.